Hello, welcome back. We are on chapter 15 of the Bhagavad Gita, entitled Yoga of the Supreme Spirit. And Sister Denise and I are just about halfway through our discussion into what is contained in chapter 15. And like you, I'm impressed at the depth and wisdom that is contained in the book in its entirety, but particularly this chapter, because it's filled with metaphors and symbology, and it's a wonderful exercise to go through it to find out what God's message is for us, the individual. And Sister Denise has been sharing her understanding and her experience of what is contained in this chapter. A very warm welcome back to you, Sister Denise. It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
Sister Denise, we finished the last episode at the end of verse 8, and I'd like to now take you through to verse 9. Sister Denise, the next verse, verse 9, deals with how the soul relates to the body. That is my understanding of it. It reads, presiding over hearing, sight and touch, taste and smell, as well as the mind, he, and in brackets, that is the fragment of the Lord incarnated as the individual soul, enjoys the object of the senses. This is a continuation of what is contained in verse 8 and the role that God plays when he's in a human body. This is my understanding of it. Do you understand it differently?
I think it can be taken in a number of ways. If God is going to come into a body, then he will preside over the sense perceptions, and he will be able to experience the objects of the senses. And here it says, I think it's connected, verse 9 and 10 are very much one sentence in a way.
Can I interrupt you? Can I read it for the
Yes.
for the viewer? When he departs, capital H, remains or enjoys, and in brackets sense objects, while accompanied by the qualities, the deluded do not perceive him, those with the eye of knowledge see him. That last two aspects caught my attention. But take us through your understanding of both those verses, please.
Well, the second verse, I think, makes it a little more clear that, okay, if God is going to come into a human body and use the human body, the person who is observing this will not see the person of God who has come into the other person's body. They will not. But the person who has the eye to see will see. Because you have the soul whose body it is, and you have the Supreme Soul who has come into that body and who is using that body as an instrument of communication, not just only to perceive the world through the sense organs, but also as an instrument of communication. Some souls will understand what's going on because they will see very subtly. They will see the invisible. But other people who are deluded, they will not see that. Of course, the other way to look at it is the one who is in the body is a fragment of God, and that's a soul. So this is the usual interpretation of it. But according to my understanding of God's ability to incarnate in another person's body, use that body, and communicate to souls through that body, only very, very few would be able to see it. So I would read it that way. And that is really because of how I have been studying Raj Yoga through the Murlis of the Brahma Kumaris and the knowledge that we study there. This is how I would read it, that those with the eye of knowledge can see him.
Sister Denise, what you just said is encapsulated in the next stanza. The next shloka reads, the yogins striving see him, capital H, again, in brackets, the embodied fraction of the Lord, situated in the self, but the unthinking, those of unperfected selves, that is a very curious expression, unperfected selves, strive but do not see him. Is this linked to what we heard in the previous chapter of the divine eye?
Well, definitely it is. And of course, this is coming after Krishna had revealed his universal form to Arjuna, who was scared, very scared, and said, just, bring yourself back to the easily viewable form. And so obviously we're aware that God is able to speak to Arjuna and in disguise, you see. And so I read this chapter as how God uses his disguise and how totally disguised he is. So the yogins, that means those who are absolutely focused on the remembrance of God, striving, the tapasya, going into a very, very subtle form of consciousness, they can see who has come in this body and who is talking to us. They can see, they can perceive, they can comprehend, because of course it's not something that's visible through the sense organs. And then you talk about the unthinking, those who haven't figured it out, the unperfected, those who are not so pure. They might try to see, but they won't be able to because of their grossness of consciousness. So I would read it that way, which I think is very fascinating, And then if you go to the next one.
Yes, is that a metaphor? It's quite lovely. It's quite lovely. That brilliance which resides in the sun, which illumines the entire universe, which is in the moon and which is in the fire, know that brilliance to be mine. That is the visuals in that. In my mind I see fireworks and lots of light and wow.
Yes.
And again I'm thinking about what you said in a previous chapter's discussion, that because we're not able to comprehend it, that is why all of these metaphors are used, so we can get an inkling into who and what God is.
Sure, absolutely. The way I would take this stanza is that the reference to the vision of the universal form, brighter than 1,000 suns. So this is the thing, God is light. And I think that very interestingly you will find that universally in all of the theistic religions, ultimately God is defined as light, but invisible light, intangible light. So here I think we've got in the Gita this extraordinary light who is absolutely disguised and invisible to all except those who really have the divine eye.
Sister Denise, what I find captivating about chapter 15 is that it appears as if God is saying, I have a job to do within the universe, and this is my vocation. Okay? Because verse 13 starts with the following words, entering the earth. Entering the earth. I support all beings with energy, and having become the watery moon, I cause all plants to thrive. Life. God the Creator.
God the Creator, God the source of life. And God is, an extraordinary energy who comes to earth. That again supports the idea of the avatar, the incarnation of God, and who gives his energy to all. And I think this is what in Brahma Kumaris, we give a lot of importance to what we call the confluence age. Between the Kali Yuga and the Satyuga, the confluence age is the age where God comes and pours his energy into us, which we have to absorb in yoga, and that then becomes the Adhar Murat and the Udhar Murat, the support of the earth and the uplifter of the earth. And of course, the watery moon has many different meanings. On the one hand, the moon is called watery because it influences water. And it also influences the subconscious, which is symbolized by water. And the moon is also the reflection of the sun. And so the human soul, who is the instrument of God, picks up the light of God and becomes the reflected light, like the moon. So I see this combination of incorporeal God and his primary instrument as being the sun and the moon. And then the action of the sun and the moon gives life to the earth. So the plants go back to the initial stanza of the 15th chapter, which is the tree. And so all the leaves are supposed to be people. So the plants thrive by the energy of God that comes from the sun and the moon of knowledge and moves through the tree trunk and sustains each and every leaf on the genealogical tree of humanity. So this is how I would read this verse.
Verse 14. Having become the digestive fire of all men, I abide in the body of all living beings, and joining with the prana and the apana, I digest the 4 kinds of food. I didn't quite get that. Sister Denise. Could you explain, please?
Well, I think this verse doesn't really follow on from what went before, so I'm not quite sure how we would want to deal with that. In some ways, you could say that it corresponds to some earlier concepts of the omnipresence of God in terms of the whole process of digestion and fire and so on and so forth, which doesn't have that much to do with what we were talking about in the first 13 stanzas. So I think this, in a way, is a bit of an anomaly.
Okay, I think we can move on. God then defines his task, which is contained in verses 15 onwards, and unfortunately we cannot go through every single verse in the entire chapter, but I'd like to take you through to the last 2 verses, which reads, He who thus undeluded knows me as the Supreme Spirit, he all-knowing worships me with his whole being, Arjuna. Thus, this most secret doctrine has been taught by me, O Arjuna. Having awakened to this, a man becomes wise and fulfills all his duties, Arjuna. Sister Denise, the fact that God uses Arjuna's name 3 times in 2 verses, that says a lot, because that alone is emphasis. And I think that it is the note on which this chapter ends, which is significant. Could you take us through that?
Well, addressing Arjuna 3 times means this is God talking to Arjuna and saying this is most secret. And I think probably what's really secret is how God comes to earth, enters into another one's body, and actually talks to that soul, which is Arjuna. And you see, he is the Supreme Spirit, and Arjuna adores him totally. But he still has to function in the world, you see. So what it also tells me is, okay, you can realize God, but it doesn't mean that you stop functioning in the earth. You have to be able to adore God completely and totally and commune with God, communicate with God. God can communicate with you, but it doesn't exonerate you from fulfilling all your duties. You have to do both at the same time. And that, I think, is a very, very important message. When you are giving your life for spirituality, giving your time for spirituality, you have to fulfill all your duties at the same time. You cannot run away or escape or anything like that. This to me is very important. And just I would like to draw our attention to verse 15, which says, I have entered into the hearts of all beings.
That is so beautiful.
Because, yeah, you hold God in your heart. That doesn't mean that God is physically in your heart in lots and lots of fragments, because then that would not be you as differentiated from God. But he says, I've come into your heart. That means you can love me, and you keep a space in your heart for God, or your whole heart for God. And so you cannot have any ungodly anything in your heart, otherwise God would not be able to dwell in your heart, you know. So I think that's a very interesting point here that helps us to understand the last verses too.
Sister Denise, how would you explain what is contained in verse 17? But the highest spirit is another, called the Supreme Self, capital S, and capital S for spirit as well, who, entering the three worlds as the eternal Lord, supports them.
Yeah, so them is of course the three worlds. So the highest spirit means the Supreme Being is distinct from humanity, from earth. He's the supporter, he's the sustainer. So there we have a reference back to Vishnu. And so again, another reference, Shiva, the creator, who initiates the world through Brahma, sustains through Vishnu, and then, as you saw in the earlier chapter, there is this destructive side which is incomprehensible to Arjuna, but it's still there, that God causes everything to return to the original starting point, which is the dissolution. So he is also sometimes known as the Lord of the three worlds, the incorporeal, the subtle, and the physical, and supports all of them, enables everything to keep running. And then if you see the following verse, the 18th, it's going again in that same direction, that he's beyond everything, higher than the imperishable, that means higher than the souls. He is celebrated as the Supreme Spirit. I mean, this is God, the Supreme Being, who is really being revealed in chapter 15, and also how God reveals himself to humanity by entering into the world and communicating to us. So this is a very, very revealing chapter.
What I found interesting about it is that God has a vocation.
Yes.
He exists for a reason. Obviously, every soul exists for a reason, but it's very enlightening to know what God's job is vis-a-vis us.
Yes.
Isn't it? Okay? Because he doesn't, because there are many who are of the view that God lives eternally in heaven and just, I don't know, stays there and waves to us occasionally, okay, when we've done something good, pat pat on the right shoulder. But what he's saying is that I am the seed of this tree, and this is my role as the creator. That's Sister Denise, the role of the tree, the description of the tree is a very powerful image.
Yes, yes. And it shows the relationship between God and humanity. It's a very sort of hands-on relationship, that God will actually come, will actually support the whole thing, and will actually enable the human spirits to have a direct encounter, a direct connection, and also he comes as the teacher. So it's a very beautiful thing to know that God is not inaccessible by any means, but that our access to God is something that God himself will make possible.
Yet, despite this, despite what's contained in this chapter, why do so many people still believe that God is inaccessible, despite having read and understood this? Why is there that gap?
I think it's because it's not totally clear, and people can still interpret it in a number of ways. You see, for me, the fortune is to have studied with the Brahma Kumaris and seen how all of this is described in the Murlis, gives me a key to be able to say, we can see in the Gita that God actually does come and talk to humanity and is accessible. Of course, aside from this, you'll see in all the main traditions of the world that there is this communication between God and humanity, but I think we also think that this happened eons and eons ago, and that now in the 21st century that's not a question. But I think what we're seeing is that every so often God and humanity come together, and there are all kinds of indicators to suggest that this is such a time. So it means we're living in very interesting times.
Yes, indeed we are. So, any message on a farewell note to our viewers who have been listening to you with rapt attention?
I think probably the important point here is that the ones who have the eye to see, if you have your third eye open, if you're able to, see through all the different veils and really see, yes, God is possible for me to communicate with. God does communicate with us, and we can have that, but we don't want to be among the unperfected, we don't want to be among the deluded ones. So there has to be that striving to keep oneself so pure, so refined, so subtle, that we're actually able to grasp it and enjoy that.
Okay. On that very high note, Sister Denise, I think we'll say goodbye to you today. And thank you, viewers, for joining us for this half hour. This chapter was particularly interesting and educational for me, who have, as you can tell from my accent, born in the West. And it is of interest to me because it reveals what God's job is in respect of the human race. It's a very clear message as to what God does, how he relates to us, and his role amongst his children. It's very clear that God has a role to play in the life of every single one of us, and I hope you have taken this message to heart. Thank you so much for joining us, and I do hope to see you soon. Take care and goodbye.